Hi, hello. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, especially in the Ada Lovelace room. I'm quite excited about that. Today I'm going to be talking about discrimination in algorithms designed to recommend and advertise to people based on their group membership. I'm a moral philosopher and I work in the ethics of autonomous systems. Sometimes these systems are embodied, things that are moving around in the world, like self-driving cars or autonomous weapon systems. Sometimes they are disembodied, like, for instance, risk assessment algorithms used in the criminal justice system, or in this case, recommendation engines. And there are all sorts of moral challenges that pop up with these kinds of technologies. They include things like privacy, trade-offs in harm, and discrimination, to name just a few. That's right. I forgot the clicker is a little bit sideways. Got it. So these are some of the important moral issues that pop up with these kinds of new technologies. Usually I focus on trade-offs in harm and risk, specifically having to do with autonomous vehicles and more with autonomous weapons systems, perhaps unfortunately. But I've been thinking recently about discrimination issues, at first in autonomous vehicles, then in criminal justice algorithms, and surprisingly now in recommendation engines. And I've come to an interesting kind of argument and position that I don't know if I necessarily believe or endorse, but it's something that I think is incredibly provoking that I want to present and have your thoughts about today. So I want to start out with a baseline case. This is based on a real scenario that occurred in the 1940s in the United States. There's a simplified version that's usually presented to law school students. There are lots of these kinds of scenarios, but let's talk about this one. It's called the red bus, blue bus scenario. Smith was run off the road by a bus late at night, causing her car to collide with a parked car. There are two bus companies in the town, the red bus company and the blue bus company. Now, neither Smith nor anyone else saw what kind of bus was responsible, but 90% of the buses on that road are from the red bus company. In the real case, Smith sued the bus company, saying it's 90% likely that they're the ones that ran me off the road. In the United States, it is what's called preponderance of evidence as a standard for guilt in civil trials. So you need to be greater than 50% confident that this person actually is culpable for the crime. Here, it seems like we have good evidence that the bus company is responsible with 90% confidence. So, do you think it is acceptable for us, based on this evidence, not based on eyewitness testimony or any kind of records, but only based on statistical information, to hold the red bus company responsible for this crime? Let's get a show of hands. How many of you say yes, based on that statistical information, we could hold the bus company responsible? How many of you say no? Ooh, I love it. That's what I was hoping to see. The Massachusetts Supreme Court agreed with you and found in the 40s that this is unacceptable. That's perfect. I'm so happy. I'm so happy I saw that. By the way, the Massachusetts Supreme Court has their seal here. Their Latin motto, as you see, nulli vendimus, nulli negimibus justicama. My Latin is terrible. Just as a total side note, I really wanted to do this with a British audience. Does anyone recognize that Latin motto that I butchered there? It's from the Magna Carta. We do not sell justice, we do not deny justice to anybody. Okay, British history, good. So, let's talk about this case in risk assessment algorithms used in the criminal justice system. So there are lots of these, and increasingly they are becoming popular. The most famous of these is the COMPAS algorithm used in the United States to assess how likely it is that a criminal is going to commit crimes again. Now, a ProPublica investigation from 2014 revealed, they sort of reverse engineered the algorithm and found that one of the most important factors they use in determining risk is age. This is not entirely surprising. I don't think any of you are going to be offended if I tell you young people are more likely to commit violent crimes than older people. But is there something wrong with this? Is this like the bus company example where we are using group membership to hold people responsible, to hold people culpable for something just because of the group they happen to belong to? So we can make an analogy here, namely, if it's wrong to use group membership alone to hold people responsible in the bus case, you might think it's wrong to hold them responsible in this case. After all, we're just using statistical data about a person's group membership here, right? Now, this is only an analogy. In order to make this a stronger argument, we need a clear definition of why this is wrong. Now, analogies are used very often in legal and moral reasoning as a kind of a heuristic. You say, okay, here's an example of something that you all agree is wrong. This case is kind of like that case, so this case is probably wrong too. But we can do a little better than that. Let's try and actually define what we mean by discrimination. And this is going to be, I think, one of the most interactive parts. So I want to ask you, what is discrimination? What does that actually mean? Any ideas? We could have someone eager to start the microphone passing around if they like. It's a word we use very frequently, very commonly. What do you think?
Clear separation or clear assignment to a given characteristic. I don't know. A group is designed a given characteristic very clearly. I don't know.
Good. So you might say it's treating one person differently or categorizing one person differently based on their group membership in some way, right? Okay, good. Now, I could say that's a good first pass. But are there other important characteristics or other important clauses that we need to add to that definition? Is every time we treat someone differently based on their group membership discrimination? Let me present you with two cases to try to test that out. Ted the bank manager and Bill the theater director. So Ted the bank manager manages a bank, as you might expect. And he just prefers to be around men than women. So he decides only to hire male bank tellers. Is this discrimination? Show of hands. This is the easy one. How many of you say yes? How many of you say no? Okay, good. Almost, I think everyone. Yeah, this was the easy one. Good. Okay, Bill the theater director is putting on a production of Macbeth. Again, British history. And he decides only to hire or interview, I should say, or audition, I guess is the word in the theater world, to audition female actresses for the role of Lady Macbeth. Is this discrimination? How many of you say yes? How many of you say no? Okay, good, good. Why not? What's the difference between those two cases? And we could have another mic for someone. I saw a hand in the back there.
It's authenticity. Okay,
explain that. What do you mean?
Well, because if they're taking a decision to have poem Lady Macbeth, the Lady Macbeth is a woman, so it's acceptable in that circumstance.
Okay, good. So you're saying it's relevant to the task. And in fact, this clause is usually built into a lot of legal descriptions of discrimination. In law in the US, in the UK, in the EU, there's usually a clause specifying that discrimination has to be treating someone differently in a way that harms or deprives them and is irrelevant to the task at hand. So let's take these three clauses as a sort of maximal definition of discrimination. It's treating people differently based on information about group membership in a way that deprives them of some important good or maybe harms them, to put it even more strongly, where group membership is not relevant to the task. Okay, now we're going to see this definition is very, very important in whether or not we take certain cases to be actually wrong or not wrong. You might say, well, this is treating someone differently based on their group membership, but it doesn't deprive them. Or it's relevant to the task, so it doesn't really count as discrimination. Now, with this definition in hand, let's now turn to the case that I want to talk about today, which is targeted marketing. And Ahmed was recommending, I think, appropriately, that maybe I should broaden my terminology here to something like recommendation engines. So a recommendation engine, specifically one that uses demographic information to make judgments about a person, about what they're going to like, about what they're going to buy, about what they're going to do. Right? This kind of technology is becoming more and more ubiquitous. I'd love to talk to some of you afterwards, because maybe some of you are actually designing and working on these kinds of algorithms. But the important question I want to ask for today is there something unacceptable about this? Is this a kind of discrimination? And here's the worry. Here's the worry. If discrimination is treating people differently based on their group membership, and it's depriving them of something that they could have otherwise had, and it's not relevant to the task, you could say that recommendation engines based on demographic data are indeed discrimination. I'm not saying that. Derek's not saying that. Right? I'm saying we could present an argument for it. And what I want to do is I want to present that argument, I want to look at the assumptions that it makes, and I want to talk about whether those assumptions are valid and sound. So here is the argument laid out. Number one, discrimination is wrong. It's easy enough. Okay. In fact, there's some disagreement amongst moral philosophers about whether discrimination is wrong by definition or whether it just happens to be wrong, but we're going to skirt some of those issues for now. Let's just assume there's something unacceptable about discrimination, either because it harms people arbitrarily, like the philosopher Peter Singer says, or because there's something unfair about it, in the way that the American philosopher John Rawls would say, I'm not imagining that I could be anyone. Instead, I am treating one person in a way that I would not treat everyone from behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. So let's take that to be fairly uncontroversial. The second premise is that discrimination is defined as treating people differently based on group membership. In fact, that's the most essential and necessary clause in our definition. The third premise is that targeted marketing, and generally any kind of recommendation engine that treats people differently based on their age, their gender, their socioeconomic status, that these kinds of engines also fall under this category of treating people differently just because of their group membership. Therefore, targeted marketing, recommendation engines that use demographic information as opposed to, say, clicking history are unacceptable. Now, this is my favorite kind of philosophical argument. It's a really shocking, surprising conclusion from premises that a lot of us took to be fairly obvious and might even say uncontroversial. That's why I started out with that base case in the Massachusetts Supreme Court example, the red bus, blue bus example. All of you said it's unacceptable to hold people responsible or to treat people differently just because of the group they happen to belong to. And just to motivate this a little bit.
I think there's a huge differences in what you're describing here, because in the first scenario, you're talking about making someone guilty about something, and the other thing is treating differently. It's completely different for me. So if you're going to treat something, discriminate, is, in the case from the buses, is just charging someone guilty. This is huge difference. So I would definitely not call discrimination wrong. So it's just, it will depend on the context, basically. So
this is exactly the game I want to be playing today. You're right on board, and you're starting out right out of the gate. Exactly. And the game is, all of us want to say that the red bus, blue bus example, and maybe risk assessment algorithms in the criminal justice system are a kind of discrimination. In fact, the risk assessment algorithms I take to be the more important and surprising claim because these are becoming so ubiquitous within the system. Right? That's much more important, in my view, to talk about, because I would say there's a stronger case to make that indeed that is discrimination. This one sort of fell out from my thinking about that one. It just fell out, and I want to talk about whether it is wrong. I don't have the intuition that it's wrong. I agree with you. Something seems fishy about this argument. But the problem is what? And that's part of the exciting thing about philosophy, is we have these arguments for things that seem sometimes crazy sounding, and if we can't identify what's wrong with them, we have to accept it. Right?
So you've missed part of your definition of discrimination.
Right. I've been a little bit slippery here. You're exactly right. So what I've done is I've included just the first clause. And so you might say, well, there's a whole lot of other clauses there. And it fails in those respects. Now, which one do you think it fails in?
It's the relevance of the task.
Okay, good.
So if your task is to, in our world, maximize someone's viewing pleasure, then you know in some way this group inference could inform whether you're more likely to maximize someone's viewing pleasure.
Good. Now, what if I were to say the same thing, though, about risk assessment algorithms in the criminal justice system? Namely, the task there is to figure out how likely it is that somebody's going to commit a crime. And if age is an extremely accurate predictor for that task, then shouldn't I use age? In fact, the strong moral argument against this doesn't say that it's not efficient. In fact, it's very efficient. When Smith was run off the road, it was probably the Red Bus Company. I mean, let's face it,
So
90%.
So are you optimizing for society or the individual? So if you're optimizing for the individual, discriminations against the individual, and therefore the false positive is damaging to the individual, if you're optimizing for society, then discriminating on the basis of age is actually good for society.
Here's a strong response to this, which is that ethics is not about optimizing. Ethics is about constraining our optimization. And in fact, here's another example I might give. There are lots of cases in the criminal justice system where I have good evidence that someone accused of a crime is guilty, but I have to discard that based on moral responsibility. Either there was a confession that was obtained through force or duress, there was some kind of documentation or physical evidence that was obtained without a warrant, and in those cases I can say, I have good evidence to believe that the client, I'm talking like the defense lawyer, like the accused is responsible, but I have to ignore or discard that. And so this is a strong response I could give in the case of recommendation engines, which is these are really, really accurate tools to figure out what people are going to like and going to do, but guess what? We're morally prevented from using them. Oh no. Oh,
I'm arguing with a moral philosopher. This is bad news.
No, please, this is what we're here for.
So the optimization in the case of recommendations,
Yes.
what you in the case of guilt, not guilt, there's a very, very bad thing and a kind of a right thing, a correct thing, if you like. In this idea of seeking to maximize the viewing pleasure, not discriminating could cause a harm. Because if there's truth in what it is you think you've seen in there, then by not applying this rule, you can harm the individual.
Good. So now it seems like the clause that you're moving towards is not so much that it's irrelevant to the task, but instead the clause about causing harm or depriving people of things. And that's another response that we could identify. In fact, let me show them. We could accept these first and third premises, but instead ask, well, is this the kind of discrimination we care about? One response is, just as you're saying, a lack of advertising does not actually deprive people of an important good. Instead, it's just directing something that other people might like towards a different audience. Another kind of response is that there's something relevant about the task of advertising where group membership is actually relevant here. Namely, it's just part of the process of presenting content to people, of advertising to people, that you care about what group they are in. So you might say this is more like the Lady Macbeth scenario than the bank teller scenario. So these are two distinct responses. But I think you see the problems, at least with the second one here. Namely, if you say it's part of the task, I might respond by saying the same thing about the criminal justice algorithm. I might say that the task there is to predict how likely someone is to commit another crime. And if that is the task, then it's not irrelevant. Right? Now you might say, well, okay, it does harm to people, however, in the criminal justice case, but not in the recommendation engine case. And I think that's a much stronger response that you could give. Now, I saw another hand over here, yeah. In fact, we're starting to get hands pepper up, and I think that's great. This is exactly the part of the talk where I want to have the most discussion, so feel free to start jumping in now, yes.
Yeah, just a few things on the advertising thing. First, I think there is sorry to move it to the realm of evidence as opposed to formal reasoning, but there is good evidence that, in fact, these kinds of discriminations do, like what things that we would definitely classify as discrimination do occur with targeted marketing. So maybe not, like a video recommender engine, maybe not, but there is good. So I refer you to the book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill. She gives examples in that book of things like people of color are more likely to see ads for probation services. Women are more likely to see ads for job postings, all things being equal, paid with a lower salary than the same job spec advertised to a man. Mm-hmm. Women are more likely to see ads for childcare products, nappies, bottles, etc. Sure. That's kind of one thing. And the other thing is there's sort of an implicit assumption here that these groups do exist. Like for instance, there is such a thing as a demographic of women looking for childcare products. But in reality, none of us here has ever lived in a world where we haven't been constantly told that women are primarily caregivers, that people of color are more likely to be criminal, that poor people aren't, educated and can't make smart decisions about their money and so on. Mm-hmm. And, you have to wonder, do these categories actually exist, or is it something that, marketers project and slice the population into? I mean, like, the classic example with like millennials versus boomers and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, that hardly applies in the States, let alone in Eastern Europe where I'm from. But people talk about it in these terms anyway because it's a convenient shorthand for slicing up marketing populations.
Yeah, good. So you raised two important issues here, and I want to talk about both of them. So the second one you raised is that these kinds of categorizations that are being made are actually reinforcing stereotypes and causing negative social impact. And I think that's a real problem, right? That's, I think, a separate problem, but a real problem, right? Which is the social impact of recommendation engines and generally of the use of algorithms to change people's behavior, right? This is something that you might not have expected from, say, social media, but it turns out that it has these important social effects that are very, very negative. So that's a separate, very important question. But the first issue that you raised sounded like it was defending the use of statistical information in recommendation engines on the grounds that, well, yes, sometimes this is accurate and there are real patterns here. But again, I would say in response, if this is depriving people or, I don't want to switch to offending people. Let's stay with depriving people for now. Depriving people for now. And in a way that's not relevant to the task. even if it is accurate, I want to go back to my original claim as a moral philosopher, there might still be something preventing us from using a highly accurate and efficient tool for predicting people's behavior. And once again, when I say it like that, it doesn't sound too crazy. Imagine I have a tool that can predict everyone's behavior extremely accurately. You might think there's something unacceptable about that on, say, privacy issues. But what I'm worried about here is not so much privacy issues, but the accuracy of knowing things about you just based on your group membership. So I'm sure all of you have had experiences like this. I was talking about my experiences with this before the talk. People identify where you're from and what groups you belong to and make predictions about your likes and dislikes, your behavior based on that. And what's most annoying about that is when it's true, at least for me. People say, oh, you're some college professor from a city, you're male, 30s, blah, 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 so you probably are some progressive atheist vegetarian who loves Game of Thrones and so on. And I say, well, okay, yeah, but still, there's something that feels unacceptable about that. But what? What is it? It's an accurate prediction about me. And in fact, those factors are good determinants or good predictors of certain kinds of behaviors. But you might still argue on fairness grounds. And I'm going to appeal to, once again, a theory proposed by the American philosopher John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice, which is that you have to treat people in a way where you don't know who they are in the distribution of social goods. You have to treat people in a way where they could be anyone. And in that kind of anonymity, we are prevented from making these judgments about people even when they are extremely accurate. Right? Okay, but these were two really great issues. Good. So I saw some more hands. Yes, in the back, please.
So I was wondering about your prisoner one, where you said that younger prisoners are more likely to reoffend with violent crime. Does it depend a bit on what you do with that? So you find statistically they're more likely to reoffend. So do you introduce some kind of intervention where you support those younger prisoners to stop them reoffending, or do you incarcerate them for longer because you think they're going to reoffend? And one of those, is actually a positive thing, preventative, and so really no harm occurs from that discrimination. And so there's a kind of a question about what you're using that discrimination for, and the context of it.
Good. So I think part of this is just a general valid criticism of the criminal justice system, which is that it's too focused on punishment rather than reform. On the other hand, the issue you're raising is an important one, which is, can you have discrimination that is a kind of morally wrong discrimination even if it benefits some people and doesn't deprive anyone else? Is that what you were asking? I think this is really good. So this clause that, well, it has to harm or deprive people seems so obvious. And in fact, as you were pointing out, sir, that seems to be the best defense against this argument, which is that advertising engines don't harm or deprive people. But we might say, even if I were to use demographic information about group membership to just simply give out things to some people and not to take away from anybody else, that there's still something unacceptable about that. Right? Now, you might say, well, it's a kind of distribution that could have been even, and then we could have an interesting debate about that. I'm trying to think of a hypothetical scenario where I say, give something to some group based on simple demographics rather than taking away from another. But it's always hard to find these scenarios where you give X number of things where you could have given them to the whole population. And I pointed out your comment and you had your hand up, so did you want to quickly respond to that?
Well, I just think that maybe in this case of kind of giving somebody some support and not giving to another group the same support, that can harm a person
Right.
in the other group. So it's kind of reverse, I think, discrimination.
Good, good. And so I want to think of a scenario where you're not giving to one group what you could have given to the entire population, but instead where you're giving to one group something that you didn't necessarily have the option to give to the entire population. And if that can be still considered unfair in some way, right, then you could argue that the harm clause is not an essential part of our definition of discrimination. Sometimes people mention this when they talk about compliments being just as stereotypical as insults. So if I say, oh, you're a member of this group, you probably like this, you're probably good at that, right? You might think there's something unacceptable, unfair about that, even if it's complimenting the person, right? And so that's the intuition that I want to hang on there. And if we get rid of the harm clause, then I think our best defense against this argument starts getting thin. I'm worried. But help me out here. Yes, sir.
I wanted to point out two things. The first one is related to the first clause, because you say that discrimination is, well, part of the definition of discrimination is depriving people, but you didn't say of what. And this definition isn't kind of abstracted from society, because, for instance, if we know that there's already been some injustice towards a group, for instance, we know that women are less likely to choose like scientific subjects at university because of some reason, like that are entrenched in our society.
Yep.
So we could actually deprive some men of some possibility, of some opportunity, in order to rebalance these.
Good.
So I think, like, defining the object of what we are depriving people of is important.
Good. So there are two responses here. I think the first one is stronger than the second one. So let me address the second one. So in the second one, you're saying this is just a normal human behavior that all people engage in. But you might say that all kinds of discrimination are natural, normal human behaviors. That doesn't make them acceptable.
It depends on who actually is marketing something. Because you can argue from some definition that if I meet you and have some expectations about you because of your ethnicity, the place where you're from, etc., this could be seen as a way of targeted marketing. So if I, as an individual, I'm adapting my behavior to that, it's different than than Facebook, just showing you only some type of content.
Sure, but do you agree that even if I forget if it was Bill or Ted, but the bank manager who just doesn't like the company of women, prefers to be around men, even if it's very natural for him to prefer to hire men, do you agree that he should fight against that natural urge that he has and try to correct for it?
Well, it represents an institution or an organization as a bank, and is not doing that as an individual.
Okay,
that's
interesting.
different.
Well, we could talk about individual behaviors outside of institutions, but I'm actually okay with saying let's just limit it to institutions for now. That's fine. So the first one you talked about is, I think, a much stronger point where you say, could we use, let's call it discrimination for good? Could we take groups who have been historically underrepresented or oppressed and do a kind of reverse discrimination marketing? So you mentioned the example of women being targeted in childcare advertisements. This has been going on for a long time, obviously. Could you redirect it intentionally and say we're going to intentionally direct some of our advertising to men having to do with diapers and cleaning supplies and so on, in order to correct for this historical injustice? This is actually a debate in legal and political philosophy about, well, quite frankly, affirmative action. John Rawls famously opposed it on the grounds that an ideal society would not actually implement these kinds of rules because discrimination is always wrong, even if it's used as a tool against historical crimes. However, there are a lot of other moral philosophers who argue that it is acceptable to use if we are in the process of moving back towards a point where ideally we wouldn't have any discrimination at all. However, even in this case, you might agree with me that the ideal society would not discriminate with our recommendation engines, right? And really, that's all the argument here wants to say. But you might still insist, if you're a deontologist about discrimination, now we've got some nice terminology here, that this is unacceptable because it treats some people differently based on group membership in a way that might deprive or harm them, and it's not relevant to the task. Okay, yes?
Sorry, this is a conversation we've actually been having quite recently. I work in news, and we've actually been talking about whether a recommendation engine which provides people with content which they like and which fits them is actually a moral wrong in and of itself.
Excellent.
Because it promotes echo chambers, and it promotes that people who have a certain view will only have that view reinforced and never challenged.
Yeah, this is something that I haven't touched on, but you're right, that's the sort of social impact side of things that I mentioned we have to be seriously concerned about. You might have concerns about this from a lot of different angles. You might be worried about it based on privacy. You might say this is private information that companies shouldn't have access to. You might be worried about it because of social impact, that it's going to force people into these bubbles. Or you might be worried about it based on unfairness and discrimination. Or you might be worried about it based on all three. So I think these are all good angles to come at the problem from. Are we concerned? Okay, so let me wrap up, unless we wanted to get Slido questions. I suddenly remember the Slido question.
Pause the Slido for a moment. But I haven't got any on here. Okay, that's Slido.
Okay, let me wrap up. I definitely want to say that the use of statistical information in criminal justice algorithms is unacceptable on the basis of discrimination. Again, this is also not necessarily a widely agreed upon claim. I think it's an important claim that needs to be made. That's the kind of claim that I started out focusing on. And then I was led to thinking about advertising and recommendation engines as a kind of analogy. Right? My thought was, well, if it's wrong to use statistical information in that case, is it okay to use statistical information in this case? It seems to me like it's perfectly fine. My gut intuition is, yeah, no problem. But I have a lot of gut intuitions that are mistaken. My gut intuition is that it's okay to eat meat, driving around in fossil fuels is A-okay. Right? I have a lot of gut intuitions that are probably mistaken. So what I want to do is to let my reason guide me and find out, look, if my best argument against the criminal justice algorithms also applies to these cases, then I've got to be concerned. And I hope all of you can join me in that concern. Thank you very much.